A girl, 20 years old, sitting on a curb at 11 at night. A single trash bag beside her, holding everything she owns. Her hands are trembling, not just from the cold. 8 months from now, her stepfather will walk into a room she built with her own 2 hands and won't have a single word to say. This is Amber's story. Let's start from the beginning. Amber Coleman had lived with her mother and her stepfather, Richard, for 6 years. Ever since her mom remarried, it was never warm between them. Richard was polite, distant, the kind of man who called her kiddo, because he never got close enough to use her name. But it worked, mostly because her mother made it work. Then, 3 months ago, her mother left. No dramatic fight. Just 2 suitcases packed one morning, a kiss on the forehead, and a promise that she'd send for Amber once she was settled somewhere new. She never got the chance to keep that promise. The night everything ended, Amber came home from her shift at the diner, tired, smelling like coffee and fried onions, to find Richard sitting in the living room with the television off. That alone should have warned her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat, like he'd rehearsed it. "Your mother's gone. She's not my responsibility to figure out how to raise a grown woman who isn't even mine. You've got until tomorrow morning to get your things together." For a second, Amber almost laughed, thinking it had to be a joke. It wasn't. "I have nowhere to go," she said, hating how small her own voice sounded. "That's not my problem." 4 words. That's all it took to erase 6 years of shared dinners and a shared last name on the mailbox. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of a bed she wouldn't be allowed to sleep in again, replaying every moment of the last 6 years, searching for the exact point she'd stopped being family and started being furniture that talked back. She never found it. By 10 the next morning, she stood on the sidewalk with 2 trash bags and a backpack, watching the door close behind her. Not slammed, just quiet and final. The way you close a door on a room you don't plan on entering again. She had $140 in her account, a part-time job that barely covered a phone bill, and no one to call. Her mother's phone rang straight to voicemail. The first night, she sat in a 24-hour laundromat in a plastic chair, pretending to wait on clothes that weren't actually in the dryer, just so the night attendant wouldn't ask her to leave. The second night, a police officer gently told her a park bench wasn't safe for a young woman alone. The nearest shelter had a 3-week waiting list. By the third night, freezing and running on no sleep, Amber understood something most people are lucky enough never to learn. Homelessness isn't one dramatic event. It's a slow, humiliating erosion. Washing your face in a gas station bathroom with the door locked, smiling at co-workers the next morning like everything's fine. Because the alternative is a pity she couldn't survive. It was on the 4th night, walking through an alley 2 streets from the diner, that she noticed a building she'd passed 100 times without really seeing it. An old brownstone, technically condemned, tangled up in a 2-year-old legal dispute nobody was in a hurry to resolve. A gap in the plywood over a ground floor window, just wide enough for someone thin and desperate to squeeze through. Every instinct told her this was a bad idea, but the wind cut through her jacket like it had a personal vendetta, and her fingers had gone numb 20 minutes ago. And one single thought took over everything else in her exhausted mind. I am not spending another night outside. She climbed through the gap. Inside, the air smelled like dust and years of nobody. Her phone flashlight caught cobwebs thick as curtains, water stains blooming across the ceiling like continents on a forgotten map. A narrow, rickety staircase near the back led up to what had once been a servant's attic space. 400 square feet tucked under a sloped roof, a single grimy window at the far end, the ceiling low enough that she had to duck near the edges. It was, without a doubt, the most pathetic excuse for shelter she'd ever laid eyes on. It was also, in that exact moment, the safest place she had access to in the entire world. Amber stood in the doorway for a long time, arms wrapped tightly around herself, and felt something break open in her chest. Not despair, something closer to fury. A hot, clarifying anger that cut straight through the cold and said, clearly, "You are not going to let this be the end of your story." She cleared a corner of debris with her bare hands, laid down the least filthy blanket from her backpack, and sat with her back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, listening to the wind rattle the loose window pane. She didn't cry. She whispered instead, barely louder than the wind. "This is temporary. I am not staying broken." And somewhere in that freezing, forgotten attic, with nothing but a backpack and $140, Amber made a decision that would change the entire direction of her life. She decided to survive. And more than that, she decided to build. The next morning, sunlight cut through the grime on the attic window, and for one disoriented second, Amber forgot where she was. Then it all came rushing back. One day at a time, she told herself. Just figure out today. She washed up in a gas station bathroom before her shift, ran damp paper towels over her face, brushed her teeth from a travel kit she kept in her backpack, and practiced her smile in the cracked mirror until it looked less like survival and more like a normal Tuesday. That became her rhythm. Wake before sunrise in the cold attic. Slip out through the gap before the street woke up. Smile through an 8-hour shift, carrying a secret heavier than anything her customers could imagine. Slip back through the gap after dark, into the one place in the world that was, however briefly, hers. Somewhere around day 10, sitting on the floor eating a granola bar stretched to last as 2 meals, Amber looked around at the mess of broken furniture and water-stained walls, and instead of feeling defeated, she felt something else entirely. This could be something. If I had time, this could actually be mine. She set a number for herself that night, scrawled on the back of a diner receipt she folded and kept in her pocket like a promise. 3,000. Offer it. That was what it would take to put down a deposit on a real apartment and stop hiding for good. From that moment on, every dollar she earned had a job to do. She started small. A battery-powered LED lantern, the kind sold at the dollar store, that she learned to angle just right for reading at night. Then a real project. A small wooden nightstand someone had left beside a dumpster. Its finish scratched beyond recognition, but light enough to carry back on her own, piece by piece if she had to. She sanded it by hand for 3 nights straight until her palms blistered, painted it a soft sage green with paint bought from a week of saved tips, and stepped back to look at what she'd made. I can do this, she thought. I can make this beautiful. She photographed it against the one clean wall she kept staged for exactly this purpose, and listed it online for $25, expecting nothing. It sold in 4 hours. She stared at the notification for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. It wasn't just the money, though the money mattered enormously. It was proof. Proof that the thing she'd built out of nothing, in secret, in the dark, had real value. That's $25 closer, she thought. 2,975 to go. More than once, sanding some forgotten piece of furniture by lantern light at midnight. A thought crossed her mind, that she couldn't quite shake loose. I wonder what Richard would think, if he could see me now. 3 weeks in, it almost ended. Amber had just settled in for the night, exhausted from a double shift, when she heard it. Footsteps on the sidewalk below, slowing, stopping directly beneath the attic window. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She killed her lantern instantly, plunging the room into total darkness, and pressed herself flat against the wall, barely breathing. I swear I heard something up there the other night, a voice said from the street. Gary, a neighbor from 2 doors down from Richard's old house. Sounded heavier than raccoons. Probably kids messing around, another voice answered. That building's been empty 2 years. Somebody should call the city about it. The footsteps faded. Amber sat frozen in the dark for a full 20 minutes before she trusted herself to breathe normally again. That night, staring up at the water-stained ceiling, she understood something with startling clarity. This attic was not safe. Not yet. Not the way it needed to be. If she wanted to keep this fragile, secret place, she couldn't just hide in it anymore. She had to make it disappear from the outside. Quiet, careful, invisible, while she kept building on the inside. What followed was the most focused stretch of Amber's entire life. The first thing she changed was color. A can of pale blue paint, barely a quarter full, brushed over a water-stained patch of wall near where she slept. It wasn't much, but the first time she stepped back and saw actual color instead of rot, something in her chest loosened for the first time in weeks. The second thing was light. She spent 3 patient nights scrubbing the grimy attic window with water she carried up in empty bottles refilled at the diner, until it finally let in real sun instead of a gray haze. She sewed curtains from discount fabric scraps she taught herself to stitch from online videos, and strung a set of battery-powered fairy lights, the rechargeable kind she picked up cheap after a shift, along the exposed wooden beams of the sloped ceiling. The third thing was the nightstand, already sold and replaced by a second small piece she restored just for herself. Sage green to match the wall, the first piece of furniture in her adult life that belonged to her and no one else. Paint, light, a nightstand. 3 changes, but together, they turned 400 square feet of neglect into something that finally felt less like a hiding spot and more like a home. Her little side business grew right alongside it. 1 sale became 2, became a small but steady stream of restored pieces moving through the local marketplace app. A nightstand here, a set of candle holders made from rescued mason jars there. The folded receipt in her pocket started filling up with small numbers crossed out and replaced by bigger ones. She wasn't just surviving the days anymore. She was closing the distance to that number, 1 sale at a time. For the first time since the night Richard closed that door, the future felt like something she was choosing instead of something happening to her. Then came the text. Thought you should know? Your stepfather's been asking around about that empty brownstone. Says he's thinking about buying it cheap and flipping it. Might want to steer clear if you're squatting somewhere around there like people have been saying lol. Amber read it 4 times, her hands going cold despite the warm afternoon air, like people have been saying. Rumors had been circulating, enough of them to reach Richard's ears. Richard, who was apparently casual enough about the whole thing to consider buying the very building she'd turned into the only real home she had left. If he bought it, if he so much as stepped inside to look around, everything would be over. Not just the physical space, though losing it after everything she'd poured into it would be devastating. He would see, with his own eyes, exactly how she'd survived after he threw her out. And some small, humiliated part of her didn't know whether she could stand watching him twist her survival into proof that she'd always been the mess he assumed she was. That night, Amber didn't sleep at all. She sat in her attic, the fairy lights glowing warm along the beams, and looked at everything she'd built, cataloging it with a kind of desperate, protective love. She would not let this be taken from her, not after everything it had cost her to build it. The next day, on her lunch break, she dug into the building's legal status and learned the ownership dispute was still tangled up in probate court. Nobody, not even Richard, could actually buy the place yet. It bought her time, not safety. Time. But it lit a fire under her that hadn't been there before. She stopped treating her exit as some vague someday goal and started treating it like a deadline she refused to miss. Amber worked harder over the following weeks than she ever had in her life. More furniture pulled from curbsides at night, more restorations finished by lantern light, more of her savings climbing steadily toward the number on that folded receipt. She picked up small commissions from neighbors who'd seen her restoration photos online, careful never to reveal exactly where she was sleeping. She researched trade certification courses in furniture restoration on her phone during breaks, slowly realizing that the skills she'd taught herself in secret could actually become a real, sustainable career instead of just a way to survive. $3,000 stopped being an abstract number scrawled on a receipt and became a date she started circling mentally on an invisible calendar. She hit it on a Tuesday afternoon, staring at her banking app in the diner's back booth, hands shaking for an entirely different reason than they had 8 months earlier. 2 days later, she signed a lease on a small one-bedroom apartment across town. Her name on the paperwork, her income behind it. Nobody's permission required for the first time in her adult life. She hadn't fully moved out of the attic yet when word came that the building's ownership dispute had finally resolved, not in Richard's favor. A distant cousin of the original owner won the probate case and sold the property to an actual developer with real plans to renovate it into modern apartments. Which was how, on a warm spring afternoon, Amber found herself standing outside her attic for what she thought would be one of the last times, there to meet the new owner about a potential design job. She hadn't expected Richard to be there too. He'd wandered over after spotting the sold sign, apparently still nursing some idle curiosity about a property he'd once considered buying cheap. His eyes landed on Amber, and confusion crossed his face, plain, genuine confusion. Why was she here? "This is Amber," the developer said cheerfully, entirely unaware of the tension suddenly crackling in the air between them. "She did the restoration work in the attic space I told you about. Honestly, some of the best independent design work I've seen. I'm hoping to bring her on for the full renovation." Richard's expression moved through several stages in the span of a few seconds. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like dread. "You did that?" he asked, and his voice had lost every bit of its usual flat authority. "The attic. You did that?" "I lived there," Amber said simply, her voice steadier than she expected. "For 8 months, after you told me I wasn't your responsibility." Richard opened his mouth and closed it twice before anything came out. "I didn't know You didn't ask," Amber said. Not with fury, with fact, plain and even. "You told me it wasn't your problem, and you closed the door. You never checked where I went." Something complicated moved behind his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or the slow, uncomfortable recognition of a man realizing, far too late, the actual weight of a decision he'd made too casually on an ordinary Tuesday night. Almost without deciding to, Amber offered to show him. Some instinct she didn't fully understand. Pride, maybe, or closure, or simply the need for him to finally see. He followed her up the familiar, narrow staircase into the room that had once been nothing but rot and forgotten time. He stopped in the doorway. Sage green nightstand, battery-powered fairy lights strung warm along the beams. Sunlight filtering through curtains she'd sewn with her own hands. Undeniable, everywhere evidence of months of patient, self-taught, unwitnessed work. Proof that this had never been the desperate mess he might have imagined, if he'd bothered to imagine anything at all. This was a home, a beautiful, deliberate, hard-won home, built by the girl he deemed not worth the trouble. "I don't understand how you did this," he said quietly. "With nothing." "I didn't have nothing," Amber said. "I had time, and I had to figure it out, because nobody was going to figure it out for me." He didn't apologize, not really. Nothing close to a real one, no speech, no moment that resolved the 6 years or the 4 words that ended them. Just something mumbled about not realizing, about things being complicated. It trailed off into silence, because even he seemed to recognize how hollow it sounded. Standing in the middle of proof that his carelessness had nearly cost this young woman everything, and instead had cost her nothing at all. Amber didn't need the apology anyway. She'd stopped needing anything from him months ago, somewhere between the first can of paint and the first furniture sale. Amber took the job with the developer. Her restoration business kept growing steadily into something with real staying power. 2 weeks after that afternoon on the sidewalk, she carried the last of her furniture out of the attic she'd once feared losing more than almost anything else in her life, and into the apartment that was hers by right, not by desperate necessity. She kept exactly one thing from that space untouched in her new home. The very first battery-powered lantern she'd bought with shaking, cold hands during her first week of secret survival. Not out of sentiment for the hardship, as a reminder of exactly how much a person can build when nobody else believes there's anything worth building. Richard never became a close figure in her life again. Some wounds cut too deep to heal all the way back into closeness, but he stopped being someone she feared, or someone whose approval she was quietly, desperately chasing. He became, simply, a man who had once made a careless, cruel decision, and now had to live with having watched firsthand exactly how wrong he was about what she was capable of. Amber never raised her voice at him, never delivered some scathing final word about everything he'd put her through. She never needed to. Her life did the talking for her. Built board by board, sale by sale, sleepless night by sleepless night, out of a condemned attic and $140, and a single refusal, on one freezing night 8 months earlier, to let a locked door be the end of her story. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't the one you speak. It's the one you build.